This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Yves Engler. This week, Human Rights Watch accused Israel of acts of genocide. Médecins Sans Frontières said similar. A few weeks ago, Amnesty International accused Israel of genocide, and there's been a stream of horrific reports about the scope of suffering of children in Gaza. Despite all that, the repression against those opposing Israel's Holocaust in Gaza is growing. Today, we will be discussing some of what's been taking place in Canada's largest city, which included a city council motion this week that's a step towards banning protests against Israel land theft fairs, against groups organizing IDF fundraisers. To discuss this, we have Aliya Pabani, who is an activist in Toronto with No Arms in the Arts. First of all, thanks for coming on Talking Foreign Policy. And can you start off with a kind of quick overview of the Toronto Police's Project Resolute, which I'm assuming the vast majority of people don't know much about, and also a little bit about your personal experience with this Toronto Police initiative.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me. And yeah, so Project Resolute is sort of the name that they're giving to a hate crime expansion, like an expanded hate crimes unit that, according to the Breaches reporting, they expanded the unit from six to I think 32 um, personnel, I guess, after October 7th, 2023. And basically, the breaches reporting sort of traced the lineage of it. And it started with this motion brought by Olivia Chow in the early days following October 7th. I think it was October 11th, called Keeping Toronto Safe from Hate, quote unquote. And so it was sort of this vague motion, that recommended various committees be formed to, look into hate broadly and also talking about Islamophobia. Um, and what it actually has done was it led to this mandate of an expanded hate crimes unit that, quote, was meant to investigate any occurrence generated as a result of protests and or demonstrations related to the Middle East conflict. So that's like incredibly broad and vague. And as we know, Toronto Police is not known for its lack of bias in policing. And so you can imagine what this has looked like in practice, especially since there are a lot, like, without going into the problem of police stats and the designation of hate crimes generally, I think even if you look at hate crime reporting, it also, depending on what community and how much social and political power they have, there's a difference in how much they report so-called hate crimes. So you can see that even prior to October 7th, there's been a long push within the sort of like within Zionist institutions in Toronto to sort of encourage the community to report hate crimes. There's been police, like now retired detective Hank Idsinga, who's known as the detective that was on the Bruce McArthur serial killer case. Also accused of bias against Middle Eastern victims. Anyway, he was going and doing sort of talks through the UJA where he would talk about reporting hate crimes to the community. So, and Muslim communities have faced, a lot of surveillance in Canada, especially post 9/11. And so there's reasons why they wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable talking about or reporting. Anyway, so all to say the hate crimes unit, Project Resolute, the most famous or well-known impact of Project Resolute has probably been the aggressive no-knock raids pre-dawn against the people who were alleged to have posted an Indigo location. It was an operation that cost over $1 million, and an expert in criminology that the breach also interviewed for a piece about this, talked about how this is an amount of resource that's usually reserved for like guns and sorry, what is it? The guns and drugs, sort of like raids, organized crime type stuff. So that's what they're using. That's the kind of resource they're applying to people alleged to have posted in Indigo. But then there's also like little ways that it's happened and that people aren't talking about as publicly because it also um, they don't want to draw more attention to themselves. But there's a lot of events, community events, fundraisers that the police will just show up at. We've heard about academic lectures where the police show up. But in the case of our work, in the past year, we've held 4 events that I can count, or that I can remember where police have just shown up. So one of them was I think the first one was a talk with during hot docs. Slado, Molly Wickham was in town for the screening of Yinta from Wet'suwet'en, and we were holding a panel that was supposed to be talking about like settler colonialism from Turtle Island to Palestine, making those connections. And what was interesting is that there was like a last minute venue change, and the police showed up at the first venue, and then when they found out it wasn't there, they came to the second venue and showed up there. And then there was a vigil shortly after that, this part of the same counter festival. And it was near hot docs, like in the street. And not only were there several officers who were there the entire time, it was for Gazan journalists who had been killed. Um, and there were also trucks parked across the street with guys with earpieces. And when I walked by later, I noticed even in the parking lot around the corner, there were a couple of those trucks, guys with earpieces. They were in full suits, armed, and we actually ran one of the license plates, and it was licensed. It was connected to the OPP. So they had like so much resource to like sit in trucks and look at a vigil from across the street. And then so then there's been 2 more. There was one at a book club recently for authors who withdrew their books from the Giller Prize this year over their Scotiabank sponsorship. Also, their sponsors, the Israeli Foundation and Indigo. And then the last one was actually, yeah, extremely strange fundraiser for a feminist collective in rural Lebanon called Meili Library. And it was a film screening that was at a local bar that was about the mass graves that were found after the civil war in Lebanon, and sort of trying to kind of speak to people who were involved in various ways and to try and sort of make sense of how the past is reckoned with. So it's like now you can see sort of the range of things that they consider um, part of this vague mandate. And I think the thing that is interesting about it is that um, like the way it's talked about is it's talked about as being like overbroad and you know there are concerns about how like anti-Palestinian bias and anti-Arab bias will be present here. But I think in some way the way that they act when they show up, I feel that they know that what they're doing. It's not they're so vague in what they say when they show up. They sort of show up and they say, "Oh, we just heard there was an event here and that we should come check it out," or "We're just here to say hi." And in the case of the fundraiser, like this is a bar in Toronto that has like super slim margins. The bar owner is a racialized woman who's there 7 days a week. She can't afford to hire security. She like is always there. She's never had the police come. And in fact, when there's been bar brawls, she's called that she couldn't handle. She's called the police, and they've showed up 7 or 8 hours later to say, you have to hire security and you're responsible for this. And so she was sort of like, I'm supportive of what you're doing, and I don't have like any issue with what you're doing. But the result is that she's sort of saying, if I apply for a permit and I don't get it next time because I was flagged by the Toronto police, like I won't know what the repercussions are, and they have no, there's no, it's not necessary for them to tell me. Like I'll never know, and my business can be compromised just because they've like flagged me in a certain way. So what this ends up doing is sort of like criminalizing this, what Palestinians talk about and Arabs talk about all the time about like criminalizing their identity, that they can't even run a fundraiser for displaced families in rural Lebanon for carpets and heaters through the winter without the police showing up. And like we're finding it harder and harder to, um, you know, uh, hold events at places because people are scared, they don't want to be targeted, or they just don't want to deal with policing in those spaces. Um, we've also had trouble with certain publications and getting things published because of similar kinds of, legal intimidation from, I don't know, people like Warren Kinsella. So I think it's just this across the board feeling that the spaces you have access to for speech and for gathering um, is just becoming narrower and narrower through these like legal mechanisms. Sorry, that was a very long explanation.
Well, it was a great explanation, and we should always remember this is happening while these are people who are opposing what everyone now, any serious person considers a genocide, right? I
Yeah.
use the word Holocaust because I think that's probably more appropriate, but with something that's by any possible description absolutely horrible happening in Gaza, let alone what's happening in Lebanon, let alone what's happening in the West Bank and expansion of Israeli settlements, bombing of Syria, bombing of Yemen, on and on and on. So this is history will not judge the Toronto police's aggressiveness against those opposing this genocide kindly. I have no doubt about that. Um, but amidst this sort of like the police's targeting of anti-apartheid, anti-genocide forces, one of the things that's happened in recent weeks and months is that a number of these charges have been dropped. And could you kind of just sort of describe a little bit? I know there's an example with the Indigo that's been dropped, a couple of people there who were, woken up early in the morning. Then there's been a individual who had his cop put his knee to his neck, busted his glasses, punched him in the stomach multiple times. That was dropped. And also, I know an issue that you're closer to with regards to the Giller protest of the Giller Prize. Could you just sort of tell us a little bit about what's happened with the police actually having to drop a bunch of these charges against opponents of genocide?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about these drop charges? So, yeah, the Indigo charges, I think it was in April, maybe June of this year. It was earlier this year where the charges were dropped against four of them. And what was interesting is in a press conference, one of the arrestees talked about how, like, no significant evidence was presented. Um, but I think the problem is that there are all these other things that happen around these charges. So two of them lost their jobs over it. One of them was actually unionized and lost his postdoc. And then there's also, with the Giller arrestees, it's the amount of time that passes. So it wasn't dropped until after over a year later. And what's interesting about it is that, and this one of the arrestees spoke at a press conference about this, but of course the media won't report on it, is that she talked about how they knew the charges were getting withdrawn months earlier, but the Crown waited until this year's Giller Gala to drop them. Like this is the thing is that we can celebrate these charges being dropped, but fundamentally the core problem remains, which is that um, some of them have been on, conditions. They've been released on conditions that you know, violate their constitutional right to protest. So in the case of the Giller arrestees, which I'm most familiar with, they were banned from any Scotiabank location, like within a certain distance of any Scotiabank location, which is, it basically bans them from exercising their right to protest against Scotiabank's investment in Elbit Systems. Um, and, you know, with this neon neck restraint, they reached some kind of a deal. But when we were organizing around encampments in Toronto during the pandemic, in the early pandemic, when police came to clear unhoused people out of the parks in Toronto, and they came with, cops in full riot gear. We saw them use that same restraint against a peaceful protester who had showed up to defend the encampment. And the same thing happened then, is that they denied the use of it despite there being like photos and videos of it from every angle. And then here they are using it again. And they also denied it earlier, but then dropped the charge or agreed to um, some kind of negotiated release or whatever. But I think the larger point here is that um there's such a low threshold for them to lay these charges. And the impact that it has is beyond the people who get arrested. It's the fear that it drives through the movement, that any small, like, excuse my language, but like bullshit action that you do could then become like a conspiracy charge or like a serious criminal charge or even a minor criminal charge, which, we've had like with the Giller arrestees, people were unable to like visit relatives in like the States. They were unable to go on work trips. One person actually um, you know, submitted a, well, I actually probably shouldn't talk about this, but yeah, this it's very restrictive. And then also, yeah, so across the movement, it makes people more reluctant to participate in their legal right to oppose a genocide that Canada is complicit in. Um, but I think the fundamental thing too is that the legal process happens like it's still there's still so much influence of like the elites in determining even when the court decides to drop charges. So in the Giller, it's a very clear example is like the idea that despite there being no reasonable prospect of conviction, that their charges were still held until after some literary gala. Like how does that make sense? Even if it's commonplace at this point that we don't expect justice from the justice system, that should be outrageous. I think along with celebrating that these frivolous charges are dropped, we need to be able to have a way to um, push back, like delegitimize the system itself, to actually like talk about how this is. I've seen it now through two, this is a massive mobilization of Torontonians I haven't seen in the years that I've lived here. But even around the pandemic and housing and homelessness, we saw a fair number of Torontonians be mobilized around it. And we saw similar repression tactics where people were charged criminally and then had their charges withdrawn unconditionally, but like over a year later. So it's just, it's a tactic the state uses obviously to try and repress a movement. And I think the unfortunate thing is that um, we still haven't figured out a means as a movement to, I mean, maintain like the strength of the escalation and like through that. I think we are seeing that it does have a broader impact. Yeah.
And on the note of escalation, again, while the horrors get worse in Gaza, we actually are seeing the city council moving towards this sort of escalation in terms of its repression. Where this week there was a resolution, a motion that was debated in Toronto City Council around restricting protests at schools, religious institutions. I think maybe community centers were in there, one or two other type institution. And this has been variations of this have been adopted, I believe, in Vaughan in response to protests, a suburb of Toronto, in response to protests against the genocide. And it's important to note that like this might sort of sound okay. Well, should there be protests at religious institutions or schools? But we do know that there's been synagogues that have hosted these fairs to sell off Palestinian land, essentially, basically land theft fairs. We know that the biggest private high school in Canada, which is based in Toronto, Tannenbaum Chat, it holds IDF days, fundraisers for the Israeli military. And there's many other examples of that. So any notion of banning protests at schools or religious institutions or community centers, well, these institutions are being often used to, enable directly Israeli crimes. Can you just talk? I know it was kind of, there's all these motions that got brought up, and the city council sort of passed some of it fully, and it's all going to be put to committee, and there's clearly lots of different forces at play in this. But can you just sort of describe a little bit about what you understand happened with this and where this might go in terms of banning protests?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that there's like a lineage from the initial motion from Olivia Chow, keeping Toronto safe from hate, because they kind of in that motion, they delineated these sort of safe zones as areas, that needed special attention of some kind. But it wasn't very clear what they meant by that. Often it would be like resourcing them to have like higher security or heightened security if they needed to, sensitive, spaces. But I think what's in that motion was unanimously voted in favor of. There were a couple of councillors who abstained. But we just see the sort of processes through which this has then become what we're looking at now, which is this bubble zone thing. What's interesting, what I saw as interesting in the debate of this is that you still see counselors, even if they're critical of this. So, like, for example, Counselor Gord Perks asked, how many hate crime convictions have we seen related to Palestine protests or whatever since October 7th? And the Toronto police rep said none in Toronto. So it's just like an admission that, that hate crime, quote unquote, stats are being used. So this is another thing. Sorry to go on a little bit of a tangent, but the thing that I found so egregious is the way that the media has just that journalists, people who have covered Toronto police for like years for these legacy outlets in Toronto, have just repeated the police news releases that claim that there's a massive uptick in hate crimes. And then they talk about like the percentage of those that are anti-Semitic hate crime reports. So there's a bunch of things happening, which is that hate crime reports are being collapsed as a category with hate crimes. So a report is different than a hate crime. And also hate crimes in Canada under the law, it's like actually a very like rigid category of things. There's the thing they're talking about is something called hate motivated offenses, which is offenses that they believe to be connected to the mandate of the hate crimes unit or Project Resolute that goes through a process where if the person is convicted in their like sentencing, that there would be a consideration. This is how I understand it. There would be consideration by the judge of like, whether it was influenced by hate influenced, I guess. But it's not an actual hate crime. There have been very few charges, like definitely under five, I think, or around under 10 in Canada, and not convictions, like actual hate crime charges in Canada. But so now the existence of this stat as narrative, like this idea that there is this massive increase in hate crimes in Toronto, is now being mobilized to justify these like bubble zones around, religious or what's seen as religious institutions. But what's totally absent from that is any mention of what you're saying, is that these spaces have been used, and it's been well documented, like that they have been used for these like illegal real estate sales. And so that fact is not in the debate about it, even though that is the reason why it's being pursued. is to protect those spaces for people who are, in violation of international law. And I just find it so strange that like the hate crime unit or Project Resolute is showing up at these like fundraisers with some abstract idea of, some potential hate crime that's being committed. And here we have like very clearly, illegal activity happening that they're fully ignoring.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable when you look at their people being recruited to join the Israeli military from Toronto, people violating, the Hesek Foundation, the Indigo bookstore owner. She has a Hesek Foundation that supports non-Israelis joining the Israeli military. That is probably in violation of Canada Revenue Agency rules, let alone looking at broader picture of international law and the fact that these many of these different institutions or individuals are enabling a genocide. Um, but thanks for this very comprehensive discussion about the repression against those opposing genocide in Toronto. Aliya Pabani with no arms in the arts. And if people like this discussion, please do like the on YouTube and share it. Thanks a lot for coming on, talking foreign policy.
Thanks for having me.